Well, good afternoon, folks, and thank you for joining the Missouri Department of Conservation for our latest wild webcast. Today, we will be talking wild turkey management in Missouri, and essentially, how does Missouri compare and where are we headed? So again, thanks for tuning in. We have two guest experts today, so I'd like to welcome Nick Oakley. He is our wild turkey program leader. So Nick, thanks for being here today.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. I'm happy to talk to the folks today.
Wonderful. And we also have Megan Duffy Yates, who is our new Turkey Habitat Initiative coordinator. So Megan, thank you for being here today also.
Yeah, thank you so much. Looking forward to it.
And again, folks, we thank you for joining us on this very popular topic. And we want to remind you that we will be taking questions throughout the presentation, which will go up until 1 o'clock. So if you have some questions, please share them through the chat box on the top right corner of your screen. So with that, Nick, why don't you tell us a bit more about your background, and then Megan, you could share some of your background related to all of this.
Yeah, well, I grew up in mid-Missouri, kind of south of Columbia on a little farm. So I'm actually one of those people who kind of taught themselves to turkey hunt, which is an uncommon situation a lot of times. But I went to University of Missouri for my undergrad. I got a fisheries and wildlife biology degree and then a forestry degree there. Then I spent the next 4 or 5 years running around out west doing field work. Ended up at the University of Wyoming for my master's work, and then followed my wife to Missouri, back home essentially to start here as the turkey biologist. I've been in the position for a little over a year now, so I'm starting to get the hang of things, I think.
Well, we welcome you back, Nick, and we thank you for being here again. And Megan, you've been with the department for a while. You were a private land conservationist,
Yeah.
And this position now is relatively new.
It is, yeah. So I've been with the department 8 years this fall. The past 6 years, I've been the private land conservationist for Barton, Jasper, and Lawrence counties. And before that, I was a wildlife biologist for 2 years. Grew up in Dallas, Texas, hunting and fishing, and kind of turkeys are my thing. That's what I prefer to hunt. So
That
yep.
is great. And again, this new position, you started with it in March.
Yes. Yep.
And
So.
even though as a private land conservationist, you've really been working on habitat and things like that for really all kinds of wildlife, limited to 3 counties. This essentially takes your expertise, expands it statewide,
Yeah.
and really gives the department a formal focus on wild turkey habitat statewide through you. And when we were talking before we really went live, if you're managing habitat for wild turkey, you're also managing it really for.
Yeah, wild turkey habitat management doesn't just benefit turkeys. It's going to benefit your deer. It's going to benefit small game. It's going to benefit insects, reptiles, amphibians,
Songbirds.
Songbirds,
So,
it's
right.
going to help benefit it.
All right, so thank you. And we're going to get back with Megan later in our conversation today. And what are we going to be doing? So our agenda, we're going to talk about the population status, where we are, how we compare. We're going to talk about some research and some updates on that. And again, a lot of people compare us to our neighboring states. So we're going to look a little bit more in depth on that with Nick. And then we're going to go back to Megan to talk more in depth about the Turkey Habitat Initiative. And as always, folks, throughout this, please share your questions through the chat box in the top right of your screen. So let's get into it. What are we seeing on these pictures?
Yeah, so the guy up there with the drip torch is creating some turkey habitat there.
Looks like prescribed fire,
doing some
which is your friend.
Fire. And then that other picture is a day or two old poult, right? And so that kind of gives you an idea of how small they are. They're only an inch or two tall, or they're probably more like 3 or 4 inches tall, I suppose. But they're really pretty fragile little animals, as it turns out.
Yes. So one of the things we want to do with with all of our wild webcasts are keep it kind of simple. So this is perhaps one of the most complicated charts, but let's simplify it and break it down. Essentially, turkey reproduction comes down to a few things. So share with what's going on here.
Yeah, so this is a cool figure from a big paper that came out in 1999 that really looked at all the factors that influence turkey populations, right, or the population dynamics. That can be kind of focused in on births, deaths, and the movement, right? So if you add reproduction to the population, you subtract mortality. That kind of gives you an idea about what those population dynamics are. So births, that's our reproduction. And then of course, yeah, deaths it's through hunting or predation, things like that.
Right, but it's the poults. That's really
That's
where the biggest challenge is right now for us.
Yep.
And then the death again, be it by humans or other predators.
Yep. Or disease or any of a number of things. Old
Right.
age even.
Right.
Absolutely.
And then that third factor, you
Yeah,
have movement.
Yeah, movement is more or less a kind of a wash, right? So we see birds come into the state or into a region and then they leave. We don't typically measure that. It's sort of assumed that that's largely kind of a wash. So when we're focused on population dynamics with turkeys, we're really talking about additions to and subtractions from the population.
Right. And we're going to get into this more in a complicated chart, but weather ties into all of these factors, the birth and survival rate, the death,
Yep.
and all of that, plus movement. And that gets back to not only weather and habitat and all of that.
Yep, absolutely.
All right. So those are the key factors. Okay, folks, and I realized I just got it word. Our chat function evidently isn't working because this technology recently upgraded. So if you can't use the chat function, please send your questions if you could email them. Okay? If you could email them to Jill Pritchard at mdc.mo.gov. Sorry, we just found this out. So email your questions to Jill, Jill, dot Pritchard, Pritchard, at mdc.mo.gov. So we apologize for that. We'll try to anticipate questions and keep going here. So as we move through this, again, production is key, and we talked about that survival. So poults, that's really that big point. So we've seen a decline in that over the decades.
Yeah, so what we're looking at here is kind of the results of our production index. So the number of birds on average across the state that we're adding to the population. We've gone through 3 phases of production as I see it. So the first phase was from like 1959 to about 1970, and we really started to see production start to take off. At this point, we're moving turkeys around the state. Turkeys are kind of settling into new habitats, starting to expand their range a little bit. The second phase was this period between about 1970 and 1985 or so that we saw really sustained high production. There's certainly some yearly variation in there. A lot of that could be driven by weather or things like that. But generally speaking, really high production. And this is when we see the harvest figure in the next slide. This is when we start to see the population or the abundance really start to take off.
Right, and you mentioned that. So the peak came from us restoring wild turkeys to every county in the state. And then we had that glory day period.
Yep.
And from that, and you mentioned it does vary because if we look at the 95 area, we had some major floods and in 93 and things like that. And like any population, is this typically normal where you increase, you peak, and then you kind of come down and stabilize, and we're getting into that stabilizing.
Yeah, this is something we see not only with wild turkeys, but most species that go through kind of a restoration period. So you see really rapid population growth, which is driven by high reproduction values. And then it hits something we refer to as a carrying capacity, where we start to slow down. The growth slows way down. And that's really what you're seeing here. As that production starts to settle into sort of an equilibrium point, that's really what we would expect to see. That and interestingly, and I think this is pretty cool, it plays out that way across the entire range of the eastern wild turkey. If you look at states, it's about 20 years after they started their reintroduction process, or after they completed their reintroduction process or repopulation process, that those states are all going through the same thing at about the same time. So
it's not just Missouri.
Nope, it's almost universal in the eastern United States.
So this is kind of what happens when you reintroduce a species and things like that.
It seems that way. Yeah.
Well, okay, so that talks about our production, and where are we now?
Yeah, so the last 5 years, I guess really the last 7 years, production's been pretty low. So the average over the last 5 years is 0.9 poults per hen, which is lower than we'd like to see it. But kind of a silver lining there is it's been very stable. With maybe if you squint, you can see kind of a slight uptick. Certainly, we'd like to see that production increase, but stability is also pretty important. So that's kind of where we stand now.
So that's the production side of things. Let's talk about now the harvest side of things.
Yep. So harvest is a good indication of abundance. That's what we use it for. It's an index of abundance. So essentially, if all things are equal and we see harvest increase, then we can kind of make the assumption that the population is grown. Rarely are all things equal, but it's the data we already collect through our telecheck system. So it's a pretty good way of looking at things.
And we're looking at, just this past spring's turkey harvest,
Yeah.
significant increase.
Yeah, we saw a really nice bump in harvest this year, about 23% increase over compared to the 5-year average, which as a single year number is our best year since 2016.
Okay, so if we look at again, kind of that trifecta, the three big influencers, habitat, predation,
Weather.
and weather.
Yeah.
And what would you attribute of any of those to this spring's production?
Yeah, I think
or this spring's higher harvest?
absolutely. I think we had particularly good weather this year. I think that's probably the biggest driver of that bump. I don't think we lost a single day to wet weather. We had some wind, certainly. Those of you who hunted the youth season can relate to that. But no, generally speaking, we had really, really excellent weather for turkey hunting this year, and it seems like Missouri turkey hunters took advantage of it.
Right, and even with that 23% higher than average harvest, should we have any concerns as far as the population numbers?
No, I mean, 1 year does not make a trend. Certainly, I'm not gonna say that our work is done, if you will. I think there's still some work to be done. Absolutely. I'm really interested to see what the next few years bring, to see if we can kind of maintain that momentum or even build on it. But no, I mean, of course, if we see a harvest increase, I don't think that's an indication that the population is doing anything but growing.
Okay, well, good.
Yeah.
So now, again, let's tell us what's going on with these slides and kind of how they
Yeah.
correlate.
Yeah, so these are the same two figures you just saw. The bottom left one is that production figure, and then the top right is that same harvest figure. These are two kind of bumps in production that we noticed, starting around 1998 and then 2011. And it's interesting how directly it correlates to those harvest bumps. So in 1998, for example, we saw a 34% increase in production, which, compared to the 5-year average, which is a pretty nice little bump.
Right.
So then in 2000, we saw about a 14% increase in harvest. Now it's a 2-year lag there, because typically Missouri hunters in the spring are harvesting 2-year-old gobblers. So that's really what we would expect to see. If you see a jump in production, 2 years later, you'd expect to see a jump in harvest. Not only that, but we see how it kind of maintains that momentum. So we had 3 or 4 good years of production there, and it resulted in actually our peak harvest in 2004 of over 60,000 birds, which is cool. Now, on the other hand, a decrease in production would have, of course, the same kind of effect, right? They're pretty well correlated. So in 2016, we saw almost a 50% decrease in production. And then in 2018, we saw a 23% decrease in harvest.
Okay. So that kind of helps us understand the correlation between those two.
Yep. So I just think it's an interesting way of really kind of making the point that production really is driving what we see as far as abundance trends, right? If a production goes up, then we see harvest go up. If production declines, we see harvest decline.
Right.
It's a really clear correlation between those factors.
So we have good research and good information on that.
Yeah.
So nest success, again, is critical.
Yeah.
And poult survival, that's where we're really having a lot of challenges.
Yeah.
So tell us about the study and what we're doing with that.
Yeah, so we did a lot of research between 2013 and 2019, and what we found was that some of the production-specific numbers, things like nest success and poult survival, were down fairly significantly from where they were in the 80s when similar research was being done in Missouri, which is which tracked pretty well with our harvest and our production numbers. So that was interesting. What was not different was that adult survival really hadn't changed much. So hens were living about the same amount of time, gobblers were living about the same amount of time. Our harvest rates on those age classes hadn't really changed much. So it really reinforced the notion that, like, we're not seeing an issue with adult survival or adult demographics. It's really that production, right? So that's the 30 days that we see nests on the ground, and then about the 28 days that poults are most vulnerable. So what we did is started another research project, because that's how that's how science works. That's how we make our regulations, right? We're not gonna react in kind of a knee-jerk fashion to changes and things like that. We need to kind of have a better understanding of what's going on at the foundational level. So my predecessor, Jason Isabel, really initiated this project, and it's actually a really cool project. But we're looking at how predation, habitat characteristics at kind of the local level, right? Like within 10 meters of a nest or of a known location where we've had poults on the ground, weather, particularly, and insect abundance and diversity are all affecting nest success and poult survival. What makes this project pretty unique is that we're looking at all four of those big categories kind of all in one big global model. So previous research has shown that each of those individually has a role and that they each have some effect on production, but no one's really looked at how they all interact with each other, which is really important because it's a very complicated system, as that first figure would show you. So this is going to be one of the very first projects to have those questions asked and answered.
And this really is fascinating because, as you said, how they interact. So predation is impacted if there's good habitat for the poults to have cover and hide from them.
Yeah, that's right.
Weather comes into a factor, but if maybe there's good habitat and there's some protection from the weather, so all of these things, again, as you just said, they really interact, and it gets a bit more complicated than a lot of people think.
Yeah,
you know, a lot of kill all the predators and we're good, or if we only had better weather, or if it was perfect habitat, but all of these things come into play.
Yeah.
So as we get into some numbers here.
Yeah, so these are just kind of early returns on some of this research. So a lot of this is preliminary, so it's worth noting that a lot of this is almost certainly going to change, but I think we can pull out some kind of interesting tidbits from this early research that actually will maybe have a potential to impact how we manage turkeys. So in particular, forest nests appear to be slightly more successful than open field nests. You can see in 2021 there that forest nests their success rate was about 40%, which is actually really, really high. In 2022, it evens out where it's probably not statistically different, but overall, if you look at kind of the average, it seems that forest nests are slightly more successful, which can very easily result in a management objective that we try to encourage more nesting cover in the forested landscape. So I think that's an interesting early result. And then the next sort of interesting thing that came out of it is we're one of the first projects to start tagging poults again. So they'd done some of this work way back when. It wasn't super successful. But the new kind of flush of research is starting to tag poults again. And so we're able to get really accurate estimates of poult survival, predation, things like that. But what I think is most exciting about this figure is that, kind of the in the literature, the number everyone throws around is the important age is about 28 days, right? And so that's from a fairly small poult to a pretty big poult. But what this research is showing that after 14 or 15 days, survival really levels off. So if we can really focus our habitat management efforts on, managing for little bitty birds that are running around on the ground, I think that's going to give us a lot more benefit than worrying about, that 28-day-old bird. Megan's going to have a picture that she'll talk about later where it shows poults kind of on the ground on the bare dirt with a canopy of forbs above them, and that's really cool, and that's what we're looking for.
Right, and yeah, we're going to hear more about habitat with Megan here in a little bit. Have some questions from folks.
Yeah.
So Waylon wants to know, so poult mortality is the biggest struggle. So why are we still allowed to shoot hens in the fall? We get that question a lot. Why don't we close the fall season? We kind of have some information on that. What would an impact be, if any?
Yeah, so, and it's a good question, and it's something, that I think is a completely reasonable question to ask. Ultimately, and we'll touch on this a little later, but ultimately, we're just not harvesting enough hens in Missouri that it's ever going to impact the state population at any level whatsoever. So what we're seeing is in our research that's currently ongoing is that our hen harvest rate, so that's the number of hens that are taken from the population, from a known marked population, is around 1%, 1.5%. Similar work done in the mid-2000s found the same sort of hen harvest rate of 1.5%. Even going back into the 1980s when our fall harvest was 28,000 birds in 1987, our hen harvest rate was 4.4%, I believe, in the Van Gelder-Krzyzewski paper. So we're just not removing very many hens at all from the population. So closing or limiting that season won't have the desired effect on production, but it will severely impact opportunity, which is the other half of the equation when we talk about how we set our regulations.
Right, because we also want to give as much opportunity for turkey hunters, and that includes a fall
Yeah,
season.
as the population will sustain,
Yeah.
right? So if we were to come to the conclusion that the population can't sustain it, then absolutely that's when we start to make those moves. But at this point, the population can sustain that type of harvest. So we still feel like there's a good chance to provide good opportunity for fall hunters who, while there may not be as many as the spring hunters, they're certainly very rabid, and I'm loath to turn away fellow turkey hunters from the passion that they enjoy.
So we want that opportunity. And while we're talking about seasons, also, we've talked before, Tim wants to know what's the rationale for restricting our spring season to half day only?
Yep. So that's been something that's been in place for the entirety, right? So when we first started hunting turkeys in 1960, it was at a half day. The idea there is that we're trying to limit the amount of disturbance we are having in the field on breeding activity and things of that nature. So that's the rationale. Certainly, there's some impact opportunity there as well, though. So.
And we know some other states have gone to all day hunting. Have they seen any impacts?
Yeah, it's fairly limited. What they tend to see is that it shifts when in the day the turkey is harvested. So certainly in Missouri, an overwhelming majority of our turkeys are harvested, before 9 a.m. But we do know that there's good turkey hunting opportunity later in the day. So what those other states that have recently shifted to an all-day season are seeing is that overall the number of turkeys being harvested hasn't gone up much. It's just changing when during the day it's happening.
Okay.
So we wouldn't see a huge jump in harvest or anything like that.
Right now, here's another question, and it's on season length and basically how that's changed, because at one point, did we go from a 2-week season to a 3-week season?
Correct.
And has there been any kind of impacts on that shift? And this is from Jim, so thank you for your question. Any changes from that 2 to 3 week season, I guess, on the big picture?
Yeah, so that went through in 1998 when the turkey population was really on the upswing, and we saw a fairly significant jump for a year or two after that, and then it kind of plateaued and has come down since. Missouri, and we'll touch on this a fair bit later. Missouri has a very short conservative spring season relative to just about every state around us. So I'm not sure. I guess that answered the question. We did see a harvest jump after we went from a 2 to 3 week season. Yeah.
Okay, so we have a question from Eric, and it's about for a landowner. And Megan, this might be kind of for you too. What would be considered, say, a sustainable harvest for adult turkeys if you have, say, 1,000-acre property of good habitat with 10 gobblers that you know? How do you kind of look at keeping that sustainable on your own property?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't have a specific number. I think the literature would indicate that, a harvest rate of around 30 or 40% is probably pretty sustainable. It certainly depends on which birds you're removing as well. If you're shooting a 3 or 4-year-old bird, there's a very low probability that bird makes it to the next spring anyway. So removing that bird would have zero impact. But the way a turkey's mating or breeding kind of ecology works is that only 1 or 2 of those gobblers will ever breed a hen anyway in one season. Certainly if they get older, they have the opportunity to breed. But typically removing males from a population with a breeding ecology like turkeys is going to have a pretty low impact overall.
And so ultimately, it really depends on all of those specifics for your property, the acreage, the types of birds, the number of birds, what you want, all of that. But kind of the one number you threw, about a third.
Yeah.
So you don't want to harvest more than about a third of your known population. Yeah. Okay. And maybe we'll get there, but we're moving on to some predators.
Okay.
And Adam has a couple questions. So raccoons. How big of a problem are raccoons? Because he wants to know when we're going to have an open season on them. So that's part of that question.
Yeah.
The other question Adam has was, will we consider limiting the number of out-of-state permits?
Yeah.
So let's jump to the back. Do you know on offhand kind of percentage-wise, out-of-state hunters versus resident hunters?
Yeah, it's around 10%. I'm trying to remember the number exactly. I think this last spring there was around 9,500 out-of-state permits sold. and that includes youth and regular season permits. That's compared to close to 100,000 of the resident permits. So yeah, at about 10%.
Okay.
And you see those certainly concentrated on public land around the borders.
Okay, so good to know. So out-of-state permits, only 10%. That's limited on some public land areas, mostly around borders. Okay. And then raccoons.
Yeah.
How big of a problem?
Yeah.
If we look at that and open season on them.
Yeah, so we've liberalized the fur bearer season pretty significantly. I don't think there's a limit on raccoons. There may be a period during the turkey season proper where you're not allowed to be out like hunting raccoons, but generally speaking, for all intents and purposes, we have almost an open season on raccoons. Whether or not they have an impact is really hard to measure. Certainly, we think that the density of raccoons is increasing across the state. But that's also kind of correlated to the agricultural processes. So it's hard to know how much of an impact it has. But certainly predation is the leading cause of nest failures and poult mortality. So predation is a part of that big figure that I showed. And in fact, I think predation's in there 4 different times. So, it's part of the equation, but these animals all evolve together. So with the appropriate habitat, a hen's going to be able to do her job and raise those poults, whether or not there's predators.
Even with if they have good habitat for good cover, then they have a better chance of surviving and increasing predators. So again, that's why they're all interspersed. Let's get back to some of our slides here. Yeah. Thank you for your questions, folks. We'll keep getting to them. And as we know,
sure enough, yeah. So of course, I get this question on a fairly regular basis. It seems like predators are a problem. And we discussed it, so we probably don't have to spend a lot of time on it. But one of the primary takeaways I want to mention about predator control is that at a large scale, things like state promoted predator control programs, they don't have it. The literature doesn't support that as a viable option.
So the science and research that we've already done on this says that by kind of really coming down on predators on a statewide basis, you're not going to have much of a positive impact.
Yeah, you have to try and incentivize people who wouldn't be doing it normally to do it, which takes an enormous amount of money. And then they're almost certainly not going to be targeting the areas that are really important, right? So removing raccoons from cornfields isn't going to help your production because there's no production happening in cornfields anymore.
All right. Okay. And just so mesocarnivores, what's that mean?
So mesocarnivores are just I think it just means small predator or mid-sized predator. So that's your raccoons and bobcats and coyotes and possums and skunks, all those kind of smaller fur bearers. Yeah. So their population dynamics are also really complicated. So if you decide that you are interested in pursuing a predator kind of or mesocarnivore control program, which to be clear, I'm in favor of assuming you've got the habitat. You need to keep a couple of things in mind. So that we typically just sort of refer to as backfilling, right? So as you decrease the density of those target species, the following year you tend to see more actual animals on your piece of property. And that's kind of through 2 different mechanisms. One's compensatory reproduction, and raccoons are well documented as doing this. So if you remove some percentage of raccoons, the following year there's a pretty strong breeding pulse, and you actually end up with more raccoons. So you have to really target raccoons year in, year out, over and over again, because the second you let off the gas,
nature abhors a vacuum.
That's right.
So it will fill it in, like that's you right. just said. So a key thing, and again, when people are talking about hawks and things like that, they're federally protected, that's so right. We can't do anything regarding that.
Yep, and they certainly have a role in this as well.
Okay, so again, what are we doing compared to other states? And as I understand it, what other states are doing, we've probably already done at some point.
Yeah, or we started out that way to begin with. So the way our regulations process works, and I'll cut to the chase here to save time, is essentially we think about all this sort of conversation we're having so far today every year. I meet with a whole bunch of people. We have these discussions. They tend to be really productive and interesting discussions, but it happens every year. Second, I think it's worth noting that each state has their own objectives, right? So when we're setting regulations, we're trying to balance our objectives for what's right for Missouri, and that's based on survey results. That's based on talking to folks. So I just want to read Missouri MDC's mission because I think it's really relevant to how I approach the regulations process. And it's to protect and manage fish, forest, and wildlife resources of the state, to facilitate and provide opportunity for all citizens to use, enjoy, and learn about these resources, right? So it's a balancing act between what can the population sustain versus how can we maximize opportunity. It's always that balancing act. And so, maybe not every state has exactly the same mission statement, essentially. And I know other states have different priorities when it comes to specifically turkey management.
All right, good to know. And again, as we look at us with other states and things, how do we compare?
Yeah, so what I did is I went to an NWTF kind of database I have access to where the state biologists are supposed to update their state regulations on a yearly basis. Some don't, so this may be a little out of date. But in Missouri, our spring season is 21 days long, a bag limit of 2, and we opened this year on the 17th of April. Now, compared to the 26 states that are a part of the Midwest or Southeast Wild Turkey Working Group, we can see that the average bag limit during the spring is about 2 birds. And generally, most states have sort of settled on that 2-bird bag limit as, again, that good balance between what can the population sustain and what maximizes opportunity. So we're kind of in line there. As far as season length, and we talked about this a little bit, Missouri's season is one of only 4 states that is less than 25 days. The average season length across those 26 states is over a month, so pretty conservative there.
So if other states are really having a much longer season, why aren't we?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think what we find is that we see that I think it's 60% of our harvest takes place in the first week of the season. So adding length to the end of the season isn't really going to change much as far as total opportunity. But yeah, I mean, there's always that chance.
Okay. And again, when we put together our seasons within regulations, Randy wants to know, why can't we just have the spring turkey season begin on the Monday right after youth season?
Yeah, so the idea there, and we're talking exactly to this on the median opener date, right? So it was really well thought out from the kind of the original turkey biologists back in in the 60s and 70s. But the idea is that by waiting until most of the hens are bred, that does a couple of things. It makes the gobbling actually more active, right? So the birds are more receptive to turkey hunters instead of being henned up, and it also protects more hens while they're out in the field. So there's fewer mistaken hen harvests. The hens are typically on the nest already, so they're not on the nest. They're initiating their kind of their nest building phase. But it does a lot for us as far as kind of minimizing disruption to kind of the breeding activity. And that's what you see sort of with that median date figure there. So Missouri certainly is one of the last 8 states in our region to open. We see several states that are starting quite a bit earlier than us. So that goes to the idea that we don't really want to interrupt the breeding activity too much.
Okay, very good. And then fall.
Yeah, so the fall season, certainly one of the more contentious components of the turkey habitat management world. So our firearm season is a month long. It's the month of October, and then our archery season is the same as our deer archery season. So it opens September 15th, runs until January 15th. We have a 2-bird bag limit for each of those for a total of 4, and then in Missouri you can harvest hens. So when we look at fall bag limits, first it's worth noting that 7 of the kind of our cohort states don't allow a fall season. They've decided to close that. Some quite a long time ago. Arkansas closed their fall season in 2009. Some very recent, right? Kansas being a clear example of that. But overall, kind of the bag limit sits around 3 birds, so we're not that far off of that. As far as season length, we have a fairly liberal season length, but we're far from an outlier there. And then the one that I think is kind of interesting and maybe surprising a little bit is that 80% of the states that allow for a fall season allow for hen harvest. So that's one of the kind of the common comments I get is we're kind of out of step with the times by allowing hen harvest, but certainly we're not an outlier there.
Okay, Chris wanted to know, speaking of that, why are hunters allowed to shoot hens with a beard in the spring? So what's the difference?
The idea is just we prefer to keep the regulation as simple as possible. So it's a bearded bird. There's an opportunity for a hunter to accidentally take a bearded hen and have broken the regulation, and we like to avoid that as much as possible, just for the simplicity's sake. Overall, this spring we harvest around 500 bearded hens, so it's a really small number.
Okay. All right. So as we kind of wrap up this part of it, where do we stand?
Yeah, so I think it's worth, just keeping in mind that Missouri spring season is really conservative. And when you hear about states making regulation changes to their spring season, more often than not, they're going from quite a lot more liberal to more in line with what Missouri's already doing. So I think that's good context to have. We do know that our gobbler harvest rate is low. So all the research we've done has shown that our gobbler harvest rate, which is really what's important as far as that goes, that the efficacy of that season goes, is around 25 or 30%. Some years it's even less. So our spring season is really sustainable as is. Missouri is certainly on the liberal end of the fall season spectrum. But as I hope I was able to illustrate, there's a lot of other states that have similar seasons as Missouri, and most states actually allow for hen harvest. Ultimately, fall harvest is on the decline. We've seen about an 80% or 85% decrease in the overall fall harvest from the 80s. And our hen harvest rate, as we've talked about, is really low.
Okay. Oh, good. Adam wants also to know, are bearded hens still fertile?
Yeah.
Okay.
There's no reason to believe that a bearded hen can't have a successful nest.
All right. So we kind of have that update. And again, Nick, thank you. That's a lot of really good information. We addressed, poult survival and a lot of statistics. Megan, now we're going to talk about habitat, which is such a key. And we're looking at some really good habitat here.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's cover, and we're going to get into more why that's good habitat.
Nice open woodlands.
And that's in the Ozarks, even.
And that's down in the Ozarks.
Yep.
And from now, is this considered forest?
That would be a woodland
It's
restoration.
open woodland. Okay, because
Yep.
you mentioned earlier, forest habitat seems to do better.
Yeah.
So this is kind of a transition between open
Yep.
field and forest. So open woodland.
Open woodland.
And let's talk about this. So Megan's going to talk about our new turkey habitat initiative and what we're doing with that.
Yeah. So I already did my introduction, so we can kind of get right into kind of what the Turkey Habitat Initiative is, and basically this is going to be a movement to kind of help create or improve on, nesting and brood-rearing habitat throughout the state of Missouri. So not only with landowners, but also on MDC managed lands, partner lands. We want to make this
Right.
a statewide thing because everybody wants to see this picture right here.
Right. Which is, that is beautiful. And so for our folks attending this too, again, we have to remember that 93% of land in Missouri is privately owned.
Yeah.
By individuals or organizations or things like that. Of that remaining 7%, maybe 3% of that is conservation areas. So it's relatively small, the control we have over our property. And then our partners, such as U.S. Forest Service or things like that, still a small percentage. So we really need to reach private landowners. And not just individuals. We're looking at this kind of as a collective, a larger approach.
Yeah, so what we're kind of seeing is this trend, and it's monoculture or these mature non-managed forests. So if you take this picture, for example, and compare it to the picture that Nick had in his slide of the woodland, there's not a lot of vegetation on the ground here in this.
Yeah, it's really just kind of scrappy and scratchy.
Bare ground.
There's nothing to eat, nowhere to hide.
There's nowhere to hide.
Right?
Some people like this, what they call park-like look.
It's nice to walk
It's
through.
nice to walk in, yeah, but it's not
supporting
nice to
wildlife.
hide in.
Right, and then the monoculture, nothing against fescue.
Nothing against fescue. I just use fescue as an example on this.
But corn, beans,
beans,
anything where it's just one plant in large, massive.
I mean, you can have a
areas.
monoculture of bluestem. You can have a monoculture of native switchgrass.
We don't want that.
We don't want that. Our turkeys require, and not just turkeys, but wildlife in general, require a variety of grasses, warm season, cool seasons, and forbs. So forbs is a fancy word for wildflowers, pretty flowers that people like to see.
And turkey habitat management also benefits another kind of iconic
The quail.
species. Yes,
Yes.
Bob White. So
Bob
if
White.
you're making land better for turkey, you're doing it
You're
better
doing
for
it
Bob
for
White
the
also.
turkey. Yeah, so this early successional habitat is going to be key.
And what do you mean by early successional?
So it's vegetation that kind of flourishes up quick. So your warm season grasses, your forbs, stuff that kind of takes over an area that's been recently cleared, recently burned, recently opened up, before kind of our woody vegetation. So your shrubs and your trees kind of start encroaching in.
So these are the grasses and flowers and things that
And you
get in
can-
there right
You can
away.
get these under trees in a
Yeah.
woodland setting, like Nick's picture showed. You can get this in those settings.
Okay.
Yep. So, they need they can't hide. They need concealment in order to sit on nests. So some nesting habitat essentials is definitely concealment. And so what I like to tell people is concealment at the 1/2 to 1 meter level. So from your knees down, basically, maybe a little
Okay.
higher than a knee. So 3 feet and down, they need that concealment to kind of hide and get in there. Avoiding areas of super high edge density. So when I say super high, it's kind of like from a forest edge right to a field edge, that kind of really thick part right between.
Yeah.
I like for people to do what we call edge feathering. It's kind of a nice, easy transition. And what that is you take a tree and you fall it down into the field, not along the edge of the field, but down into the field. And then what happens is the grass kind of grows up. The tree will die, but then that's cover, right? Grass will kind of grow up into that. And an example I like to use with landowners is I take a softball with me. This helps for quail. This helps for turkeys. You can throw that softball into that down tree. And if you can see the softball, that's great, but it's still got the canopy of that tree over it to kind of hide it. So they can get in there and then your avian predators aren't able to get down on top of them. Raccoons don't want to get in there because a lot of people like to do edge feathering, but then they pile trees on top of each other to a point that it's too thick. And then raccoons like to hide into
So again, it's that
brush piles.
balance. You want it dense enough to hide, but not too dense not to be able to move around.
Exactly. Yes.
Okay, and
yes.
that's where expertise such as yours comes in to
Yeah.
help landowners.
And private land conservationists
Yes.
throughout the state, and their site visits are always free.
Right, we're here to help.
That's why we're here.
Literally to give you
Yes.
that expertise so you
Yep.
don't have to figure it out on your own. So that high density and then thorny vegetation.
Vegetation.
That good?
Vegetation we don't like is great for turkey.
So we're talking what?
This is
Blackberry patches?
blackberries,
Thistle?
thistle, yeah, which the native thistle is actually good and it's great for even our pollinators. Greenbrier, a lot of people don't like greenbrier. That's another one. If you think about it, us as a human, we don't want to walk through that. So a raccoon, nest predator doesn't want to walk through that.
You're significantly larger than the poults.
Yes.
Just boom, go
They
in
can
under
go
most
straight
of that and hide.
This is also for hens to hide in. She can
Yes.
get in there. Those feathers kind of help protect her from that thorny vegetation. She can get in there and hide, and then she's able to escape pretty easily. But a raccoon doesn't want to do that.
Right, so that's what makes it key, what nest placement?
Yeah,
And
so
they don't want bare ground.
they do not want bare ground, and nest placement also. So let's say you're doing what we call timber stand improvement. That's kind of thinning out your unwanted tree species to open the canopy up, allow sun penetration onto the ground itself. Well, you can, and a lot of people don't like to see it, but fallen timber looks kind of ugly. But for a hen, that's great. She can tuck herself up against that down log,
Right.
and she's concealed in there. And then a lot of vegetation is going to grow up around her.
Right. And her coloring, as we could see
She
from this
blends right in.
picture, right against that log. You
Right
can't even
against
see
the
that.
log. So she's blending right in. She's got vegetation around her. So she's going to be pretty well concealed. She can still see everything kind of near her, and she has easy escape.
And then the density of vertical
Yeah,
stem.
so there comes a point in habitat. So you get this early successional vegetation, but without prescribed burning or herbicide treatment or some kind of control, woody vegetation is going to take back over. That's just the succession of
Right, and if we've
vegetation.
ever seen the before and after of a prescribed burn, you take that overgrown, can't even get through,
Yes.
burn it within really a year.
A year or 2 years, it just depends
Becomes ideal.
on your habitat. But there comes a point when there's too much density of vertical stems and she can't escape. So that's where we can kind of come in also and help a landowner kind of determine, okay, this is getting a little too thick. Let's do a prescribed burn on your place, open it back up, create that habitat again for her. And then kind of getting from the nesting into brooding, as Nick has pointed out, the first 14 days post-hatch are the most crucial for our poults. They're flightless. They can't thermoregulate at this time. They're very tiny. So they're really dependent on the habitat around them. So providing escaping cover, loafing, and then even roosting cover on the ground, and also kind of quality food sources. So your insects, arthropods, for example, are key. Arthropods, so grasshoppers.
Yeah, just general insects.
Bugs,
It's
right?
fun things
Grasshoppers,
that-
beetles, bugs, stuff.
Anything that crawls around, hops
Right.
around, flies around that they can reach. Yeah, so that's early successional habitat is key. But then as part of that, adding small shrubs into that kind of equation is great because those provide cover, especially when poults can't quite fly yet. They can kind of flutter and hide. They can flutter right into those
Right.
shrubs.
Jill wanted to know what's loafing. I mean, that's resting. Yeah, hanging out.
Humans do it all the time.
Yeah,
Right?
so they just really kind of want a place to.
But we like to loaf
Yeah.
around, right?
Yeah,
Turkeys
okay.
do the same thing.
Got a couple more questions. If we could
Uh-huh.
jump into some questions here. Do we know of research on how conservation grazing, patch burn grazing, for example, the impacts that has on nesting success and poult success?
Not on turkeys. I do know we've done a study on quail on patch burn grazing.
Similar.
It's very similar. I actually work with a landowner that does patch burn grazing on some native prairie, and I implemented a listening point on his property before patch burn grazing, and then I've done that ever since. And within the 6 years he's done it, we've gone from hearing, and this is an 80-acre prairie, but now it's, in the grand scheme of things, property is about 1,000 acres.
Okay.
But on that 80 acres, going from hearing 1 or 2 coveys, and now we're hearing 4 to 5.
That's great, more than double.
So it's more than double.
So what we know is, yes, it has a positive impact on
It
ground
does.
nesting birds. Jeff wants to know, how can deer hunters change their food plot activities maybe or varieties to encourage turkey?
So a lot of deer hunters like to do kind of single species food plots.
Again, monoculture doesn't work.
If you can change that up and do multi-species, I'm not personally, as a deer hunter, I'm not big into food plots. I like to, there's native vegetation all the way around. Now, food plots do help bring in the deer.
Right.
But when I do food plots, I do multi-species. So I usually do like turnips, radishes. I do put beans into there. And then I also mix in some wheat. And if I'm feeling a little saucy, I'll put in
Okay.
some other kind of mix.
So,
Just depends on what
yeah,
sheet.
it's like a salad. So you're building a
Yeah,
salad.
so
basically.
multi-species, it's multi-levels.
Right.
And then, not doing food plots that are just cool seasons. There's warm season food plots also that are helpful and beneficial to wildlife. So
And again, we have private land conservationists
We do.
here to help
Yep.
with this, so we can come out and give you a game plan.
we do.
And it's all free.
We don't just focus on
Right.
native stuff. We can help
Right.
you with food plots.
Nick or Megan, why don't hens sit on their nests in the morning? Colby wants to know.
So hens probably do sit on their nests in the morning a fair bit. So we call it recesses when the hen will come off her nest. So once she's laid all of her eggs,
Girls got to eat, right?
Yeah, she's got to eat and get some water
Yes.
and just generally kind of like move the lactic acid out of her body, I think is part of it as well. But you'll find that hens, once the eggs are all laid, they spend 22, 23 hours a day on the nest. Before all the eggs are laid, they actually just drop the eggs and then they move away from the nest. And those kind of periods, that 8 or 9 day period where they're placing eggs but then not at the nest, is kind of an interesting and unknown little period in the animal's life cycle.
Good to know. Megan, Greg wants to know, when's a good time to say brush hog to help prevent nest damage?
Okay, so this is, and I'm going off of our CRP guidelines that, so our Conservation Reserve Program through the FSA office, so our Farm Service Agency offices that I am officed out of as a PL, as a private land conservationist, our mowing and haying guidelines, and this is for warm season conservation reserve programs, is July 15th.
Okay.
Anytime after that. Now, I like to say push it as far back as you can.
As far as back as you can.
You'll
but,
get double nest.
Right.
You'll get turkeys that'll re-nest if their first nest failed.
Okay.
Quail the same way. Our quail study, quail nested all the way until October.
So good to know, folks. For quail, it's all the time, so never. And for turkey, it's either late July.
Into August. Yeah, late
early,
July
yeah,
would be.
okay.
Uh-huh.
All right. And you talked about CRP. Kevin wants to know, are there any funds available to help supplement landowner efforts to improve habitat?
There are. So we've got our state cost share program, which is a landowner assistance program. Yep. So right here, actually, it's on the slide. So we have state cost share opportunities, and then we also have federal cost share opportunities. So through the federal side also, and there's multiple different programs you can go through. So that's part of our habitat initiative. So I'm in the process right now, working on creating kind of a guiding document for landowners, and then also for our MDC staff, for their, managed public grounds. But I'm creating a guiding document for landowners that has pictures like, okay, my property looks like this, but I want it to look like this. How do I get there? And then we're working with various partner agencies and partner groups to kind of look over that document and also give some ideas back. I'm going to be doing statewide landowner trainings for MDC staff, but also for landowners. I'm doing workshops throughout the state. And then, yeah, definitely there's cost share opportunities. And that would be, you have to go through your private land conservationist, have a site visit. They can come out. We do cost share work for burning, for timber stand improvement, pollinator
There's a lot,
plots.
right.
There's a whole plethora of things that we can
There's
cost
a
share.
lot of different cost
Yes.
shares. So again, your private land conservationist is your key contact point, and they can really help
They can.
customize things for your land.
Yep.
So speaking, you mentioned a burn plan and thing. Steve wants to know, besides maybe a burn plan, and we're talking about this, other things landowners can do to increase their turkey hatch.
Yeah, so that
habitat.
TSI, that timber stand improvement, is a big one. That's a lot of people are afraid to cut trees. And so as a private land conservationist, I can come in there and I don't ever hesitate to contact forester, have them come out too. Foresters like to come out and look at property and talk to landowners also. Foresters can be like, yes, keep this one, don't keep this one. They'll even help a landowner kind of know what trees to what we call tag to harvest and
right.
kind of take down, so that they'll do that. Burning is another one. Planting that early successional habitat, pollinator plots. So everybody likes to look at pretty flowers. Those are another great.
Right, Missouri natives.
Missouri natives are the best.
Yeah.
And if you've got cattle, you can implement and start rotating in warm season grasses and, start grazing a mix of that.
And you talk wildflower plantings and things like that. So Adam also wants to know, if you're not a landowner, maybe what can you do for turkey habitat if you actually don't own the land? I don't know. Adam?
If you're hunting on somebody else's property, it doesn't hurt to say, hey, listen, do you mind if I have a private land conservationist come in? They can consult with us, and then I can do the habitat management work for you.
So maybe you could work with
You can
landowners.
work with your landowner. I do that
Where you
on
hunt,
property
right.
I hunt on. So
That's a wonderful way to work
It is.
together.
It is.
Right.
Yeah,
Nick?
and kind of building off that, we're starting to see a proliferation of these prescribed burn associations popping up across the state. So these are kind of groups of landowners who are trying to increase, brood habitat typically on their property using prescribed fires. So you don't need to own property to help participate in these prescribed fires. And if you can be a little selfish and help a guy on a burn and get some hunting permissions, and
It can work. Nick, you bring up a really good point. So we also have, again, we're working with the Missouri Prescribed Fire Council on creating these landowner collectives for prescribed burns, because what we know, habitat just isn't your property. Turkeys don't know, wildlife doesn't know property lines. So that's why we want to work together. And we also then have our Deer Management Assistance Program, which is another opportunity for landowners to come together collectively and vastly increase the acreage, the habitat acreage that you can do. So why not be able to do this for turkey, quail, and some other things, which is kind of what we're looking to do.
You
more
can have
informally.
informal turkey co-op.
Right. And Nick, like you said, help on that prescribed burn. It might be an opportunity to hunt there in the future.
Yeah.
So non-landowners can really help by working with landowners on accomplishing these habitat goals. And we're working with a lot of people.
A lot of partners.
So this kind of final slide-ish is really the partners.
These are all the partners that we've got kind of in communication with us right now, working with us, anybody and everybody you can think of. They all have a passion for turkeys, turkey habitat, turkey hunting. So they're a big help.
Right. And again, all of that, Chris wanted to know, can you just quickly talk more about prescribed burn cost share? So somebody wants to do a prescribed burn, and we talked about, we have all these various pots of monies available from us and from the federal government.
Yeah. So I will say, landowner cost share for the state, we can cap out at $6,000 per landowner per fiscal year. Practices that go beyond that. So usually when I have a larger landowner, I usually use state cost share as kind of getting a landowner's foot kind of into the door to kind of see what they want. Then we can use federal cost share for bigger practices. But for burning, they can get cost share for burning for timbers, woodland areas, glades, grassland.
Right.
They can get cost share for putting in fire lines. It just depends.
Folks, we have so much that we can offer. We can't cover really any of it to any great in-depth degree here. So what we really recommend is, again, work with your Missouri Department of Conservation private lands conservationist. They're available in every county. Also visit our website at mdc.mo.gov. You could search prescribed fire. There's a ton of information in there. The habitat initiatives, you could find your local private lands staff and everything on through our website and all of that. So it's really a valuable source of information. We covered a whole lot here today. So, you know, my mind's kind of full here. My brain's full. Thanks, folks, for all of your questions. I believe we've really addressed all the questions that we got. So thank you for those. Nick, thank you. Megan, thank you. If you want more information on these topics, on this information, on wild turkeys in general, give Nick an email, give him a shout. And then also for Megan, you could reach out to her via email if you have more questions on the Turkey Habitat Initiative and all of that. And if you want to share this with some other folks, we will have this posted on our website at mdc.mo.gov and just search Wild Webcast. This will be posted in the next couple of days, so you could share that with others. And that kind of wraps it up. Nick, thank you again for being here with sharing your expertise.
Yeah,
Really
absolutely.
appreciate it.
This was fun. I appreciate the.
And Megan, thank you so much for being here, sharing your wealth of expertise.
Yeah, I'm
And-
excited.
Yeah, folks, you know, get our staff out in the field to help you. We will have another Wild Webcast on Strange But True, Missouri Critters and Plants, some animal oddities and such coming up on July 26th, so you can register for that. And again, all of our other webcasts are on our website at mdc.mo.gov. Kind of wraps it up for today. Thank you for being here. Get outside and discover nature.